honey. That's how the bees use the honey. But let's get the human back into the equation. How do we get the honey? So in this modern day, we have these frames. Again, as I said, I don't need to destroy the whole hive to get the honey come out. I can just select the frames that have the most honeycomb. I can pull those out, close the hive back up, leave them as they are. And then I can take these frames. Okay, so here's a picture of a frame. This is ideal because this entire thing was honeycomb. Sometimes, lots of times, a hive will have a mix. They'll store everything in the comb. So you'll get a frame that'll have some honey, it'll have some larvae, some eggs that the queen laid and they're raising them into new bees. It'll have some pollen stored up. But ideally, if we're harvesting honey, we want as much of that frame as possible to be honey. And so here's a frame, the whole thing was honey. The bees sealed it off. Most of that white material that you see, that's just wax that they use to cap every individual cell to seal and protect this honey until the winter. So as a beekeeper, you pull this frame out of the hive, you take it to a processing area, you get this type of knife is a very common tool. Lots of times this knife will also be electrical so that it can be heated because it's a lot easier to slice through the wax with a hot blade. You melt the wax in the process. So you'll run that blade up and down to cut open and expose all of that honey. And that's what will allow it to start oozing out of the frame. A lot of people do it this way, where you'll use this hot knife to cut open all the wax. Another way that people will do it, as you see on the right here, is just you can cut the wax completely out to make the wooden frame hollow again, and then you just mash it all up. So you have this big mush of honey and probably some pollen that was in there and a lot of wax. If you mash it all up, you just need to filter it. If you slice it open, as you see on the left-hand side here, the most common way that people will extract the honey is with a centrifuge of some kind. So you'll use that hot knife to uncap, to slice open all of that honey so it starts to ooze out of the cone. Then you'll put the cones in a centrifuge like this, and whether it has a motor or a hand crank or it's hooked up to a bicycle, there's all kinds of setups. But you will power it to turn, and it'll turn faster and faster until the force of the movement literally throws or whips the honey out of the cone. That honey will smack up against the sides of this centrifuge, and it'll slowly ooze down and collect at the bottom. And then usually, again, there's probably still some wax and other debris in there, and so you have to filter this honey out somehow. And again, there's all kinds of different methods that people use. But however you're doing it, you're ultimately taking out the honeycomb, breaking it up, destroying it to try and get all of the honey out, and then inevitably putting it through usually at least 2 separate filtration processes to get the comb and other potential debris out. Once you've done that, you bottle it up, and that's honey, and that's how humans collect honey. That is the most simple process. Putting it through just a couple different strainers is the most simple way that it can be done. If that is all that is being done when the honey is bottled up, we refer to that as raw honey, which is basically just saying that it is minimal processing. The only processing we've done is enough to get it out of the wax and get it in a bottle for you. This usually means that it's not perfectly filtered. You might find a little flake of wax every now and again. There might be an interesting flavor profile because some pollen that the bees were storing got into that wax or got into that honey. Ultimately, this isn't an issue. You can still enjoy the honey just fine. The fact that some of the pollen can get in the honey is the reason that some people will consume honey as a way to try and counteract seasonal allergies. The idea of kind of like a vaccine, you're dosing yourself with small amounts of that pollen that irritates your body until your immune system figures out, oh, this is what this pollen is. Now I have the opportunity to try and fight it off. And I can attest to that. It's pretty effective. If you have bad enough seasonal allergies that you want to try something like that, I would suggest more than consuming local honey, and that would be the emphasis. If you want to try and work up an immunity or a resistance to local pollen that you are having a reaction to, you need to be consuming local fresh honey. But even better than honey would be just pollen. And there are beekeepers all over the place. They're not as common as your average beekeeper, but a lot of them will also separately collect pollen from hives. And you can buy just a jar of pollen and take it by the spoonful, mix it in with your yogurt or whatever else, and you can dose yourself that way. And I can attest to that. That definitely helps with my seasonal allergies. Again, it helps when I'm consuming it fresh. It doesn't help if I'm eating pollen from 2 or 3 years ago, because it's not necessarily the same profile of what's out there right now that's agitating me.
Here's a question, Taylor.
Yep.
What is pollen?
Pollen is the male structure that plants produce that has to bond with an egg in order for fertilization to occur and in order for a seed to be formed. So the general way that flowering plants do this in a system with two different sexes, male and female, is that you'll have flowers either that are separately male and female, or flowers that have both male and female parts. One of those parts is producing pollen and just putting it out there. Another one of those parts is kind of like a Velcro surface, sticky area that is meant to receive pollen. If the right pollen from the right species hits that spot, it'll stick, and that pollen will actually grow a root-like little tube or hair down into the flower to the right spot where it finds an ovary. And then it will it will literally penetrate that ovary. That is when the exchange of genetic material occurs that allows plants to undergo sexual selection. Of course, there are plenty of plants that can do it all on their own without a partner. There are some plants that can do it both ways. There's a lot of diversity out there. But pollen is basically the male equivalent of sperm that carries genetic material to an egg that once fertilization occurs and those two things meet up, seeds can be formed.
We have 2 more questions.
Yeah.
About how much honey do you typically get each early spring from one hive?
From one hive. It is, of course, variable every year, especially in terms of how hard of a winter did we have. The longer the cold temperatures go on, the longer that the bees are in there eating up whatever honey they have. So, in years where we have a long winter, where Puxatawny sees a shadow and we have that extra couple weeks of cold weather, we can get a lot less because the bees needed it. However, I'd say on average from a single really healthy hive, probably between 50 and 100 pounds of honey. That is kind of an average, but that's also kind of a best case scenario. Again, like depending on the year, there are some winters where it was just really rough. Maybe the summer before was extra dry, so they didn't get that much honey anyway, and they end up having little to no honey left over that I can take. Other years there will be a huge bounty. But yeah, we're definitely, if you can keep healthy hives and you can manage them properly year after year, even with just a couple hives, even as a hobbyist, if you have, let's say, 3 or 4 hives, if you know what you're doing and you have healthy bees, you're easily going to get over 100 pounds of honey. It's a great way to always have a gift to give your friends and family, and even make a little bit of money on the side. But yeah, even if you are an individual house or individual homeowner and you're interested in keeping some bees and getting a little bit of honey yourself, all it takes is one healthy hive for you to have more than enough, more honey than you would ever personally consume, and you'll end up giving it away.
Here's another question. Chris asks, I am gaining a new hive in a week here in Alabama, about 3 pounds of bees and a queen. Should I add some supplemental patties, although we have a great nectar sources?
Yeah, on average, I would say you don't have to immediately start feeding them. Again, it's seasonal. It will depend on the region you're in. And as you're saying, I don't imagine that there's any shortage of blooms where you are right now. So I would say go ahead. If nothing, set the bees up in the box and just keep an eye on them and see over the first couple weeks that they're there, how are they doing? You know, how much nectar are they bringing in themselves? Because you may find that they've got all they need and you don't have to bother putting that food in. Normally, I won't worry about feeding bees until later in the fall when I really start assessing them for the winter of like, do I think they have enough honey? If not, do I want to supplement them and how am I going to do that? But throughout the warm season, unless we are having a really long and bad drought and there's just no nectar out there, even if the flowers are open, there's no water for the plants to give up to make nectar. In that situation, I will feed them during the warm part of the year, but more often than not, just let them go. It might take a little bit longer if you're saying that you're buying 3 pounds of bees. That increment is usually used referring to when like you're buying a box of worker bees and you're buying a queen separately, and you're going to introduce them together into a box. They can take a little bit longer to get settled in that situation simply because they're usually not coming from the same hive. That queen wasn't raised in the same hive that all those workers were in. So basically, it just takes time for them to acclimate to each other, for the queen to pump out the right pheromones to basically say, I am the queen, I am your queen, and everything's okay in the hive. And then the workers have to get used to that scent. They have to accept her as the queen, and then they can move on. That would be opposed to usually anytime you want to buy bees, they'll be sold as boxes of bees, as I just described, or they'll be sold as nukes. A nuke is short for a nucleus colony, and that is usually you'll get a box that it's already a hive box. It usually has 3 to 5 frames in it. Those frames already have wax comb built out. They already have bees on them, and there's already a queen in there. And so that is like, it's a hive, it's fully functioning, it's ready to go, it's just small. And so those can build up and start collecting nectar very quickly because they're basically already ready to go. You just put them in a box that's larger, give them more frames, give them more room, and off they go. With the boxes where you've got separate workers and a separate queen and you're introducing them, it'll just, it's not going to take long, only a couple more days, maybe a week, but it's going to take them a little more time to get settled before they really get going, establish their hive, start bringing in a lot of nectar. Anyway, that was a tangent, but I would say initially I wouldn't worry about feeding them. I would just monitor them. And if there seems to be an issue where they're not bringing a lot of nectar in, maybe I would consider feeding them at that point. But before I started feeding them, I probably want to try and figure out what is going on. Why are they not taking in nectar? Is it just because it's really dry and there isn't nectar out there? Or is there a disease? Is there some other issue at hand? But just observation is key.
We have one more question. Does a hive have a lifespan, or will it live forever as new generations of bees and queens are born?
Yeah, so in theory, a hive can live forever, in perpetuity. The reason that works is, again, because the hive, as in all of the bees collectively, is the organism. The queen is laying eggs. All of the bees in a hive are the children, the offspring of that one queen. All of the worker bees are female. The only significant difference between the queen and the worker bees is that the worker bees are infertile or sterile. Their ovaries never fully developed. So the queen is the only one that can reproduce. And I won't, there's a lot more fun complexity of like, what does that mean for them genetically and how we define them as individual organisms. But basically, the hive is a unit, and when the hive swarms, a swarm, a lot of people, whether you've seen pictures or in your own life, you may have experienced seeing like a big ball of bees hanging in a tree or hanging on a fence, and a beekeeper had to be called to come and collect them. That's what we refer to as a swarm. There's a lot of different reasons that a swarm could happen. It could be that a queen unexpectedly dies for some reason. Maybe she gets too old and she slows down. Maybe she's not laying as many eggs as she normally should. A healthy queen is laying upwards of 2,000 eggs a day. If she starts laying even 1,500 eggs or less a day, the workers notice, and the workers start to decide, something's wrong with this queen. We need somebody that can do better. And it is the workers, in whatever situation, it is the workers that decide that a new queen needs to be raised. If the old queen is still alive, when her daughters begin to raise a new queen to replace her, she notices this, and she knows the first thing her daughter queen is going to do when she hatches out as an adult is she's going to try and find her and kill her. There can only be one queen, and odds are the younger, smaller, more agile queen is going to win out. So most commonly, when a new queen is being raised and the old queen is still present, she recognizes this and says, I have to get out of here if I want to survive. She'll start pumping out a unique blend of pheromones that tell all the workers in the hive, I'm getting out of here, who's coming with me? And she'll recruit through these scents up to like 60% of the workers in the hive. And so they'll leave. And that's the ball of bees that you see in a tree or wherever else. That's the old queen that has left. And they're hanging out in a tree while they send out scouts to look for a new place to make a new hive. This process of swarming, where the old queen leaves with a certain amount of the bees, but some of them stay behind, and the bees that stay behind help raise the new queen. This process, because the hive is the organism, you see the process of swarming as the natural way that the hive reproduces itself. So although as a beekeeper, there's challenges to swarming of like, you don't necessarily just want to let it happen and lose a bunch of bees and potentially a really good queen. However, if you are keeping really healthy hives, they're going to be swarming every single year. And that's a natural sign that they're doing it right. Another common way that they'll swarm is the hive will just get too big. There's simply too many bees in the boxes. Sometimes you can just give them another box to the hive and give them more room, and that's enough. Not always the case, and sometimes there's like too many of us. We need to split. Some of us are leaving. But anyway, because when they split, there is always a queen left over. Usually it's a new queen that needs to be raised up. She is left behind with workers, and she will grow up, she will go out. But so during the warm months, during the summer, the average worker bee is living about a month. In any situation, the average queen bee is living 3 to 5 years before, usually within that time period, the workers are going to decide it's time to replace her. So you have individuals, including the queen, that are moving on or dying and getting replaced on a regular basis. However, the hive as a unit can remain. And that is why you can have the same hive go on year after year after year if they're healthy. Yeah.
Here's another question. When it's hot outside and there's clusters of bees that are outside of the box, how do you know if they're going to swarm?
So when it's really hot outside, it's common that you can see a bunch of bees just hanging out on the outside of the box. They're not flying away. They're not flying around. They're literally just like standing on top of each other, making a big ball, or literally hanging off. This is called bearding, bee beards, just because especially if you have your hive propped up on some stilts, you can have bees coming out of the entrance and just hanging over the side, looking like a beard on your hive. This is actually a way that the bees manage the temperature of their hive. It's one of the really fascinating forms of intelligence that the bees practice is temperature and humidity management of the hive. There's lots of different ways that they can regulate it. And when it gets too hot, usually the first thing that they'll do is You'll have bees standing at any holes or entrances of the hive where air could go through, and they'll stand in certain directions and beat their wings to try and encourage a current of air to move so that they can get airflow and they can cool down the space. If it gets just way too hot, the bees know, like us, that the fastest way to cool down a room is to leave it. Just like, there's too many people in this room, some of these people have to leave. Get these warm bodies out here so the space can cool down. And so if you walk by a beehive and there's just a big ball of bees hanging out on the outside, that's usually what's happening. It's that it got too hot on the inside, and so a bunch of them have just temporarily vacated to allow the hive to cool down, to allow themselves to cool down. And then usually later in the evening, everybody will make their way back in. Most of the actual signs that you can look for that would tell you that a hive is going to swarm, you are only going to see inside the hive. The most common one being when you actually see new queens being raised up. Because the queen bee is significantly larger than the worker bees, the cell that she needs to mature in has to be larger. And so it visually looks larger and different from the rest of the wax comb, and you can, with enough experience, you can pick them out. And so, it's a combination of knowing, like, oh, well, this is the right time in spring, this is the right time of year when I expect the hives to be swarming anyway. So I'm going to be looking at my hives on a regular basis, at least once a week, and I'm going to be thoroughly looking on the combs for those queen cells. And if I find them, then, that's my first sign of, okay, they're getting ready to swarm. And then I have a short window that I know, like, okay, within X number of days, this new queen will have hatched and they will be swarming. And so, you have a short window. If you're on top of it and you're paying attention and you're looking for your hive, you usually have a short window of recognizing they're going to swarm. What do I want to do about that? But usually you wouldn't see that the swarm is happening from the outside unless the swarm is happening and suddenly there's thousands of bees making like a cyclone right outside of the hive, basically when they're all leaving together, and then you'll see them fly off. They usually won't go more than like a couple hundred feet, and they'll find a place to post up and hang in that ball until they find a new location.
Have you noticed if there's any recovery trend in the collapse syndrome?
Say that again, Alex.
Have you noticed if there's any recovery trend in the collapse syndrome?
The colony collapse disorder. That is a very real issue for beekeepers. At this point, the information out there talks about how it's a complex issue because there's a lot of different factors. It's not just a particular disease. As however organic or whatever earth-friendly practices I want to practice, my bees are not aware of that. And I can make the most beautiful, organically managed garden for them, and if there's a big field of canola flowers that's managed conventionally, including the use of all kinds of herbicides and pesticides, the bees don't have that awareness, and they'll just be like, look at all these awesome canola flowers, and they'll go and there's a lot of documented cases of particular pesticides. Fortunately, in Maryland, there's been a lot of legislation over the years of trying to eliminate neonicotinoids, which is a specific class of pesticides using chemical compounds found in tobacco plants. Hence, it sounds like nicotine because it's that class of chemical that's being used. The tobacco plant uses nicotine as a natural pest deterrent, and basically humans found a way to make much more intense pesticides out of that. The problem is, even if the bees land on flowers that have been sprayed by this, and it's like a very trace amount, it's not going to kill that bee. But the bee can get some of that pesticide and bring it back to the hive. And then as they walk around, especially as they walk around on the wax comb, they can literally press these chemicals into the wax. And so it's been years in the making, but there's research starting to show that, if you have a hive that is consistently visiting flowers that are consistently sprayed with different pesticides over the years, we can actually find that concentrations of those pesticides build up in the wax of the comb that the bees are using. And it can get high enough that it does become fatal to the bees. But so again, at this point, the colony collapse disorder is basically seen as a complex of issues that is not totally understood, but to the extent that we do understand it, it's a recognition of there's not going to be an easy fix to it. A lot of it has to do with beekeepers changing their management practices, but also that is where a lot of the push of educating the public on the importance of bees is coming from, because it takes the involvement of the public. It takes the public awareness to push for legislation to try and eliminate things like neonicotinoid-based pesticides, to try and minimize, at least eliminate some of the pressures that these hives are experiencing. But usually when people refer to CCD, colony collapse disorder, they're talking about a hive that succumbed to a myriad of different pressures. It's usually not a single one. So unfortunately, it's an ongoing issue, but we got top scientists worldwide working on it. And the University of Maryland has a bee research lab, and there's a lot of good work coming out of them on a regular basis. They also, for anyone that's interested, to go through their website and find them, they post annual statistics on just the number of beekeepers in Maryland, the number of hives that they're managing, the number of hives that are lost each year. That's a common number that's used a lot, especially in the fight for different legislation. I believe, I haven't seen this year's, they're not in yet, but for the last 2 years throughout Maryland, the average loss of colonies has been around 60%. So it's very much still an issue. But again, we got lots of people working on it. There's lots of hope out there, not just from educating the public and everybody becoming aware of this issue, but lots of beekeepers pushing for different changes in management practices, and especially in breeding more resilient bees that will be able to fend off pests and diseases better. And most importantly, bees that are bred to be better acclimated to our local area. I believe the person earlier said they were down in Kentucky, or they were somewhere down south, especially because it's warmer for a longer period of the year, a great place to raise bees. And in fact, especially if you are buying bees online, more often than not, they're coming from somewhere down south. They're coming from Georgia more often than not, which isn't inherently a bad thing. Like, they can be very healthy bees. They can come from a really good beekeeper that knows what they're doing. But the problem is that when you buy bees that are bred and raised in the Georgia climate with the Georgia seasonal weather, and for however many generations that hive has survived there and learned to adapt to that setting, and then you ship them in a box up to Maryland, where our seasonal climate is significantly different, you can have a problem of you can get bees through the mail and they never really do that well. And sometimes you just have to chalk it up to, like, well, they're not local bees. They're not acclimated to our conditions. And so there's a lot of beekeepers more often, or more than ever, that are pushing for communicating with each other more, and talking about if you need new bees, talk to other local beekeepers and buy your bees from them, because then at least you're getting bees that are already aware of the challenges that you have in your local area, be that the climate or particular pests and diseases, and then they'll be that much more likely to thrive.
Let's see. We have a couple of more questions, but maybe we can just do them a quick round, since it's already 8:00. So let's see. How much honey does one worker produce in their brief lifespan?
I have some info about cooking with honey. I'm just gonna have it up on the screen while we talk. I don't remember exactly. I think the number has changed, like the research has changed over the years, but it's something insignificant, like a teaspoon, like a single worker in her lifetime, and that's just like working for the last couple weeks of her life as a forager. She'll bring home enough nectar to be converted into like approximately a teaspoon's worth of honey. And even crazier than that, that she won't get a drop of that. By the time that nectar that she brings back has been converted into honey and is being consumed, in all likelihood, she'll have died already. And so every that another part of the amazing, the true hive mind mentality of the bees is that they are solely working for the greater good of the hive. Every bee is putting the hive over their individual immediate concerns, and part of that being that every single bee, the labor that they put into managing the hive, it's all for the next generation. The next generation being, coming in a week, because the queen's constantly laying new eggs. But it's always about taking care of each other and taking care of the future generations.
Do hives have different collective personalities, like aggressiveness or passiveness and other factors?
Yeah, absolutely. That is something that people try to breed for. They definitely the same as all other animals that have been bred throughout human history. Um, Docility, is that how you say it? Bees that are more docile are more desirable. There are definitely bees that are much more aggressive in general, just like if you come near the hive, or especially if you try to open up the hive, they can get aggressive much more quickly, but it's not always the case. Most of the bees that I've ever worked with today are pretty docile. At this point, if I'm working with brand new bees, especially like if I'm collecting a swarm and I don't really know their temperament, I'll usually have the headdress on. We refer to it as the veil, just to protect my face. But especially any time that I'm working with the hives that I have and that I've kept for years, and they're pretty docile, and I know how they act, I don't wear any protective gear. And as long as I'm calm, they're calm. So yeah, they definitely can have demeanors or personalities, shall we say? But it's amazing how reactive they are. Again, it seems like if I'm very calm and very slow and smooth with my motions as I open up the hive, then they stay calm too. If I'm really jittery or nervous, or I'm not paying attention and moving faster than I should, basically, if I get jittery or nervous, then the bees notice it, and then they're like, wait, why is he nervous? Should we be nervous? And then they'll be a lot more defensive. Um, there are cases of particularly aggressive genetic lines of bees that get out. Basically, like you have a hive, they raise a new queen, that queen goes out, you don't know who she mates with. Maybe she mates with somebody that has some really aggressive genetics. And suddenly a hive that you've had for multiple seasons that's always been really chill is a lot more defensive and a lot more willing to sting you to get you away. That might be because the genetics have now changed with the new queen. Um, but for the most part, they're pretty docile. That's a big part. We do tours all the time out here where people can come out and open a hive with me. And, the first thing we always talk about is trying to reassure people that, this isn't a wasp or a hornet hive that we're going into. Bees are not mean unless they have to be. And even then, they seem to have some awareness that, like, unlike wasps, they can only sting you once. Most people have heard the idea that when a honeybee stings you, their stinger gets stuck in your flesh. And so when they try to pull away from you, they actually end up ripping out some of their guts and they die in the process. And so they definitely seem to have an awareness of, yeah, I've got this really powerful stinger, but I can only use it once. And so it's my last resort. Most of the time, if the bees are getting frustrated or agitated with me, they'll start flying really tight circles around my head, kind of telling me like, maybe you should back off. If I don't pay attention to that, they'll start flying into me. I'll start getting bees like smacking me in the head, smacking me in the face. And that's their way of saying like, hey, last chance, buddy, go away. And if I don't listen to that, then they'll start stinging me. But overall, they're not super mean. They're not super aggressive. They're not trying to sting you unless you're really bothering them.
That leads into someone's question about the pictures that we had up, showing that people were in bare skin without protection from the bees. Um, so you want to talk a little bit about that, or?
That is just a personal choice. For me, when I first got into beekeeping and I wanted to do everything right, and you just learn here's all the equipment you need, including the suit. So I bought the suit, the full body suit with the big gloves to protect myself. Part of it, very quickly for me, I got frustrated, and part of the frustration was that it felt like I was in a spacesuit. It felt like I want to be interacting with the bees, but I'm not really interacting with them. I'm just like isolated in my spacesuit, and I'm trying to fumble around in here. And a big appeal for being a beekeeper for me is direct interaction with these amazing organisms. So I didn't feel like I was getting that with a suit. And the gloves, in order to be durable enough to prevent the stingers from getting through, they're just big and bulky. It felt like I was wearing mittens, and I didn't have the dexterity or the finesse that I wanted to use as I was trying to flip through the different frames and pull them out, rearrange them. And so I stopped wearing the suit pretty quickly, and for more reasons than not, it was just out of frustration of like I can't work in this suit, so let me just take it off. But it was also, I learned it from other beekeepers who didn't use suits, and basically encouraged me of just like, if you're calm and you know what you're doing, then it's not a bother to the bees, and you don't have to wear the suit. So I don't wear any equipment. Part of that came out of convenience. Part of that came out of the excitement of feeling like I'm actually interacting with the bees, feeling more like I am meeting them on their terms, and I'm entering their world when I go into their hive and they're flying all around me. They're checking me out as much as I'm checking them out. And also just a good meditative practice for me of, again, if I don't fully understand it, but if you're in a bad mood, the bees can tell and they react accordingly. So it became a good meditative practice for me of like, if I'm getting ready to go out to open a hive, or if I want to go out and open a hive, I need to be in the right mindset, and I need to take the time to calm myself and clear my head and focus in on the here and now. And when I'm opening a hive, that is 100% of my attention. That is all I am doing in that moment, and I like the experience that way for it. I mean, that being said, I know plenty of amazing beekeepers who always wear a suit, and it's not like it's not like you're not a true beekeeper if you don't wear a suit. To each their own. And there's the full range of, you can get the full body bee suit. I will say that's the space suit. They feel really cumbersome. Even if you invest in a really fancy one that has, like it's made of porous material, so you get a little more air circulation, they're still just overwhelmingly hot, and you have it on for a couple minutes before you're sweating buckets, and you just want to take the thing off anyway. Again, if I'm working with a hive that I'm not familiar with and there's a risk of getting stung, I ultimately just want to protect my face. And so you can buy a veil that, rather than the full suit, it is just a headpiece. And I'll put that on, and it ties off to hold it in place. So sometimes I'll wear that. More often than not, I just come as I am.
Do you think that GMOs have a negative effect on the bee population?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot about GMOs that is still inconclusive, which I think is where a lot of people's concern comes from. For better and worse, we just simply don't know. And a lot of us that express concerns about it, it comes from a place of, why risk it if we don't know? I have not seen a lot out there specific to, you're saying like how are bees who are collecting nectar and pollen from GMO plants being affected? I haven't seen a lot of specific research on that. As far as I'm aware, there is not an immediate direct concern there. However, again, at this point, my personal concern with GMOs is just that we don't know enough, in my opinion. There's a lot of, in some ways, I'm comfortable with, like, yeah, that's research that's worth looking into and seeing, what genetic changes that are potentially very beneficial that we could make. But the concern is creating GMOs and putting them out there into the world before we feel like we've taken the time to really understand the impact that they're going to have. And it's the same concern that I have of, introducing a non-native species without doing the research to really understand, is this organism likely to become invasive really quickly, or is it going to be able to find its niche and naturalize? If we just don't know, rather not risk it. That being said, specifically relating to bees and the materials, the nutrients that they're bringing back from GMO plants, I know of no direct concern. Unfortunately, as a beekeeper, there's kind of always that frustration at the end of the day that it's out of your hands. The average hive will have a foraging radius of upwards of 3 to 5 miles that foragers will go out away from the hive looking for food sources. Of course, if they don't have to go that far, they won't, but if they search, a mile around, 2 miles around, they don't find anything, they'll just keep going further out. If they find a food source much further, if there's 2 food sources, but the one way further out is more desirable, maybe there's a lot more of it, maybe the nectar's a lot better, they will favor that one, and they'll go to the closer source a lot less, where they'll ignore it completely. So like when my bees go out and they come back with nectar, like ultimately, or for the most part, I have no idea where they're going. And this is the real concern of just, in terms of, well, what if they're going to a field where pesticides are being used, or what if they're going to a field where GMOs are being used? There might be some effect. We don't have an effective way to track the bees when they go out at this point to know, yes, this bee went here and they probably brought X, Y, and Z back to the hive. It is for that same reason that there's no such thing as organic honey, at least within the U.S. The USDA has no standard for defining organic honey. And the main reason is because when the bees go out and they collect nectar from whatever, and you can't trace or document that, you don't know. I can manage my bees organically. I can choose to use treatments to combat their pests and disease that fall under organic management practices. But I can't guarantee that the plants that they're collecting nectar and pollen from are being managed organically. And for that reason, there is no destination. The only person that I've ever seen come close to being able to definitively prove that their honey is organic is a beekeeper that owned an island off the coast of Maryland. He owned the whole island. He kept his eyes on the island, so he knew, I'm managing the island organically, and they're not going any further than the island. So outside of a very unique situation like that, you have no idea where the bees are going and what they're bringing back. And to that note, I talked about those unique situations where you might find varietal honeys. They can have really awesome, unique color and flavor profiles that make them really desirable. However, more often than not, the honey that you're getting is just a mix. It's all kinds of different plant nectar that the bees brought back. And we label that as wildflower. If you go to the store and you buy a jar and it says it's wildflower honey, that's the beekeeper saying, I have no idea where this honey came from. It's just a hodgepodge.
What about mites or other enemies? How do you mediate anything like that?
So the Varroa mite is the most prevalent pest that we have in the beekeeping world right now. It came from Asia originally, but it's a worldwide honeybee pest. Basically, they will latch. They're very tiny. They'll latch onto the backs of bees. They have straw-like mouth parts, kind of like a mosquito or something, and they'll suck out vital juices out of the bee, weakening them, weakening their immune system, and worse, they are a vector for disease, meaning that they carry a lot of different viruses that they can infect the honeybees with. So they weaken the bees overall, and they can introduce a lot of diseases that the weakened bees have a much harder time combating. As much as possible, I am striving toward breeding bees that are acclimated to our local region, and a big part of that being that they have some kind of resilience to the varroa mites. There's a lot of different particular attributes and behaviors that beekeepers try to breed for to minimize mite populations. One of the biggest ones is what we call hygienic behavior in bees. And that is basically where we have found that bees have a natural tendency, they're very clean, fastidious creatures. They're constantly cleaning the hive and each other. And there is a behavior we found in honeybees that if there's just a bunch of bees crawling on the comb together and one bee sees a mite on another bee's back, it will actually go and try and bite and rip off that mite to take it off of its sibling bee and try and destroy it. This behavior or this impulse to clean each other and to get mites off of each other is stronger in certain genetic lines of bees than it is in others. So some bees are very hygienic, some bees not much at all. So that's one thing that we breed for. We try and encourage the bees to be more hygienic and try and get rid of more of the mites on their own. Beyond that, there's plenty of different chemical treatments that you can buy, running the full range of very intensive and synthetic to much more mild and organic. Part of me consistently observing my hives is observing for the presence of varroa mites. I'm not trying to consistently treat for varroa mites on a fixed schedule. I'm more trying to constantly be observing them and trying to manage. Varroa mites are so prevalent that pretty much whoever you learn from in this day and age, you tend to be taught beekeeping as just always assume that there's varroa mites in your hive. Your goal is not to eliminate varroa mites. Your goal is to keep their population low enough that they don't drastically affect the health of the hive. So I'm going in, I'm always expecting there to be varroa mites, but it's only when, for different reasons, I see their population really increasing significantly that I'll go in with a treatment. For me, those treatments are always organic certified ones that are usually produced from a naturally occurring organic acid, usually collected from plants of different kinds, like formic acid, for example. And it's usually just like a little sheet of material that is like a wick, and it's soaked in this formic acid, and then you just lay it in the hive. You allow it to basically fumigate the hive, and especially the organic acid treatments that I use. The idea is it will fumigate the hive. It will not be so intense that it will harm the bees, but it will be concentrated enough to kill the mites. Again, I'm never looking for that to completely eradicate the population of mites, just hopefully bring them down to a more manageable level. But there's the full range of products that people use out there. There are people that swear by no treatment, just like keep your bees no treatment. If your bees die from varroa mites or some other disease, that means those were weak genetics that you don't want to keep anyway. When I first started, I was very into that idea. I wanted to be all natural in that sense. And after 3 consecutive years of losing every single hive every single year, I caved at that point and recognized, like the idea of the bees being resilient enough that they don't need treatment is beautiful, but I clearly can't keep bees that way here. And so at this point, I selectively use organic treatments for varroa.
Awesome. I think that sums up all of our questions. And sorry for all of the folks who are wondering if we were going to end, or since we're going a little over time. Taylor, do you have anything that you would like to sum up everything with?
No, I mean, this was, a very broad, general kind of presentation. I hope that it just gives everybody a better perspective of, what's actually going on. Again, an appreciation of the process from nectar in flowers to honey in a jar at your house. The amazing process that the bees go through, and hopefully it inspires you to support local beekeepers by buying some fresh local honey, and it'll be that much tastier when you appreciate the process. And of course, if people have more questions, just about anything relating to honeys and bees and beekeeping, you can reach out to us again. We do, as I said, we do hive tours and honey tastings out here. So if you want to go on the website or talk to Alex and set up a time to come out and experience that yourself, you can. If you're not in the area, I know that some people on the list weren't local. You can still reach out to us or find a local beekeeping organization in your area. Everywhere around the world that I've ever gone has, at the state level, at the county level, local beekeeping organizations that are very excited to teach you everything and give you the right information. So there's plenty of resources you can find. And yeah, thanks for being with us tonight.
Awesome. I did miss one question,
Yeah.
and folks are hoping to know if they can have beehives in neighborhoods.
So in Maryland, or more specifically in Frederick County, I really only know the local jurisdictions laws on this. So check your local laws about this. But in our area, the rule is that a hive has to be at minimum 10 feet from any property line. So of course, if you're in an HOA, I would probably bring that up with your HOA and figure out if there's going to be any issue there. You might not want to. That may or may not be something you want to ask for forgiveness instead of permission. But in our area of Maryland, in Frederick County, 10 feet from any property line. That could also be vertically. There are some people within the city of Frederick that keep bees on the roofs of buildings, and they can do it because it's high enough that it's still technically 10 feet from a property line. However, even with that rule in place, you really don't need that much square footage in order to be able to fit a hive. So it's very feasible for the average homeowner to keep a hive if you want to learn the process.
Awesome. Thank you all. Thank you, Taylor. This was a really informative presentation. And I'll be sending out the PowerPoint as well as the recording for any folks who would like that, and any slides that we might have missed. But yeah, this was really great, and I really appreciate everybody for coming out. I'm gonna end this recording. Take care, everybody.
Well, good night.